The snow pressed down on the world with a silence that felt heavier than grief. A German shepherd lay still in the frost, his breath shallow, almost invisible against the cold air. His fur, once a proud golden black shield, was matted and dulled, stiffened by ice. Around him, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if even the trees knew how close he lingered to the edge. His eyes were barely open, 2 dim embers in a fire nearly gone out. He had known warmth once. The crackle of a hearth, the voice of someone who loved him. But here there was nothing but the bite of winter and the fading drum of his heart. When the crunch of boots finally broke the silence, he couldn't lift his head. He wanted to, desperately, but his body was stone. Hope arrived not in thunder, but in the gentle hush of a stranger kneeling down, gloved hands brushing snow away from his face. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, something stirred inside him, not strength, not yet, but the faint memory of what it felt like to be wanted. The forest was quiet, too quiet for late afternoon. Normally. The pines whispered when the wind pressed against their needles, but that day even the air seemed reluctant to move. The snow had been falling in soft, unbroken sheets since dawn, layering the world in a sterile whiteness that dulled every edge, softened every sound, and buried anything fragile beneath its weight. In the heart of that silence, half hidden beneath the skeletal arms of a fallen branch, a German shepherd lay stretched against the frozen ground. At first glance, he looked lifeless. His coat was tangled with frost, stiff with the residue of days exposed to the bitter air. If not for the faint rise and fall of his ribcage, almost imperceptible beneath the ice-crusted fur, he would have been indistinguishable from the discarded branches around him. His eyes, dull and sunken, opened only when the sharp crack of footsteps broke the stillness. He didn't lift his head. He couldn't. But the sound awakened something buried deep inside. A memory of belonging, of someone who once called his name, though the sound of it was lost now in the fog of neglect. The rescuer came stumbling through the snow, her breath hanging in visible clouds that dissipated before her face. She wasn't looking for him, not exactly. She was looking for signs, tracks, movement, the sudden shift of shadow against snow that might lead her to animals reported wandering the outskirts of town. But when she saw him lying motionless beneath that broken tree, her body froze with the kind of instinctual ache only compassion can summon. For one terrifying moment, she thought she was too late. She knelt slowly, not wanting to frighten him, though fear seemed far too strong a word for what lingered in his body. There was no energy left for panic. No bark, no growl, no trembling recoil, just stillness. His eyes, though dim, shifted toward her, and in them she saw a faint glimmer of something unspeakably fragile, not trust, not hope, but the desperate recognition of life clinging by a thread. Her gloved hands brushed snow from his fur, gently clearing the frost that clung stubbornly to his ears, his muzzle. His nose was dry and cracked, his paws swollen from the cold. She whispered words without realizing she was speaking, her voice trembling, as though syllables could anchor him, tether him to this side of life. "It's okay, I've got you. Don't give up now." The words were more for her than for him, but his ear twitched faintly, as if acknowledging that sound mattered, that being spoken to still meant something. She slid her hands beneath his body and was shocked at how light he felt, all angles and bones, as though life had already been leached from him. He whimpered faintly at the movement, a sound so delicate it felt like glass cracking in the stillness. She pressed him against her chest, pulling her coat around him, as if her body heat alone could substitute for the warmth he had been denied for so long. The snow continued to fall, dusting her shoulders, her hair, his limp body. Each step she took toward her truck was heavy, the ground uneven beneath the weight of both her urgency and his fragility. Inside the cab, she placed him on a blanket, the kind she always kept ready for moments like this. She cranked the heat, her hands trembling as she tucked the fabric tighter around him. His breaths were shallow, rattling faintly, and every second she feared one might be his last. She kept speaking, filling the cab with a constant thread of soft sound. Promises he couldn't understand, but ones she needed to say aloud. "Stay with me. Just hold on. You're not alone anymore." The drive back to the shelter was a blur of snow, blind roads, and trembling glances at the bundle on the seat beside her. Once, His eyes fluttered open. For a brief second, his gaze caught hers, and she felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't strength she saw there, but something else. Something quieter, like a question he didn't have the energy to ask. She whispered back the answer anyway. "Yes, I see you. You're safe now." When they reached the shelter, the air was alive with movement. Doors slamming, voices calling, hands reaching. The dog was lifted onto a stretcher, rushed inside under fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects. The rescuer followed close, snow melting from her boots, her heart pounding against her ribs as though she could will her strength into him. On the exam table, his body looked smaller, more fragile, under the harsh brightness. Every rib was visible beneath his thin coat, his chest rising with uneven, stuttering breaths. The vet moved quickly. IV fluids inserted, warm towels layered. A stethoscope pressed against his chest. Numbers were murmured, oxygen levels checked, temperature readings announced in tones that hovered between urgency and disbelief. The rescuer stood in the corner, hands pressed together, watching. Her throat burned with the weight of helplessness. She had found him. She had brought him here. But now the fight was beyond her hands. It was between his body and the storm it had endured for too long. She whispered a prayer. Not one of faith, but of desperate human hope, that somehow he would choose to stay. For long minutes, the only sounds were the hum of machines, the sharp rustle of fabric, the urgent commands of the vet. Then, finally, a change so subtle it almost went unnoticed. The shepherd's breathing steadied, his chest rising more evenly, the rattle easing. The vet glanced up, gave a small nod. "He's still with us." The rescuer let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She stepped closer to the table, leaning down so her face hovered near his. His eyes flickered open once more, and this time there was something new in them. Not strength, not yet, but a fragile spark that hadn't been there before. As if some small part of him had recognized that maybe, against all odds, he wasn't entirely lost. The storm still raged outside, snow burying the world in silence. But in that sterile room, under the glow of two bright lights, hope had found its way back into the fragile body of a forgotten shepherd. It was a beginning, fragile, uncertain, but real. And beginnings, even the smallest ones, can change everything. The ride back from the edge of death did not end with the snowstorm. It began inside a room lit too brightly for comfort, where machines hummed like a choir of fragile promises and the air smelled of antiseptic and warm cotton. The German shepherd lay wrapped in layers of blankets, his frail body dwarfed by their bulk, as though he were a ghost draped in the trappings of life. Each breath was shallow, uneven, but no longer disappearing into silence. Life still clung to him, though only by threads so fine the rescuer dared not blink, afraid she might miss the moment they snapped. She sat beside him on the floor, her back against the sterile white wall, knees pulled to her chest. Her gloves were gone, her hands trembling from exhaustion as much as from the chill still clinging to her bones. Every few seconds she leaned forward, listening, watching, the faint lift of his ribcage, the twitch of his paw when warmth began to creep back into stiff joints. His body smelled faintly of damp earth and unwashed fur, a scent both heartbreaking and grounding. She whispered again, as though he might drift away without the tether of her voice. "You're safe. Stay with me." The vet moved in and out of the room, adjusting tubes, checking readings, murmuring instructions to the assistants. An IV line dripped steadily into his leg, feeding him fluids his body had been denied for too long. Another line pushed warmth through his veins. The rescuer watched, a helpless bystander in the battle being fought between fragile flesh and stubborn survival. Each beep of the monitor echoed like a distant heartbeat in her chest. Time blurred. Outside, the snowstorm faded into night, but inside, the shepherd's fight stretched into hours that felt like days. His eyes opened briefly, dull amber catching the fluorescent light. They were not curious eyes, not trusting. They were eyes worn down by abandonment, carrying the weight of hunger, cold, and fear. Yet when her face hovered close, something flickered, a moment of recognition, not of her, but of the simple fact that someone was here, not leaving, not turning away. She reached out carefully, letting her fingertips rest against his paw. His skin was rough, the pads cracked, the nails worn uneven by months of wandering. She expected nothing in return, but after a long moment, his paw twitched against hers almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a grip, not yet. But it was enough to send a rush of heat through her chest, as if that tiny gesture was proof of a battle tilting toward survival. In the following days, fragility became their rhythm. The shepherd ate nothing at first, his body too weak to remember hunger. Food was placed near his nose, the scent lingering in the air, but his eyes closed as though the effort was too great. The rescuers fed him with syringes of broth, drop by drop, coaxing warmth into his body from the inside out. Sometimes he resisted, turning his head weakly, but more often he simply yielded, letting the nourishment slide past his tongue because resisting required strength he no longer had. At night, the shelter grew quiet. Other dogs barked, restless in their kennels, but in his room there was only silence punctuated by soft breathing. She often stayed past her shift, curled in the chair beside his bed, her head dropping forward in half-sleep, her dreams tangled with the sound of his breath. Each time she startled awake, her first glance was always the same, searching for the rise and fall of his chest, that fragile signal that he was still here. By the end of the first week, change came like the faintest echo of spring after a brutal winter. His eyes stayed open longer. He shifted when blankets grew too heavy. His ears flicked toward sound. The squeak of a cartwheel, the murmur of voices outside the door. It wasn't strength, not yet, but it was movement. It was life beginning to stretch after being buried too long beneath silence. One evening, she carried in a small bowl of softened food, sitting cross-legged beside him. "Just try," she whispered, placing it within reach. His head turned slowly, his nose brushing the rim. For a long moment he did nothing, and disappointment began to press against her chest. Then a single tongue flicked out, tasting. She held her breath, her body rigid with hope. Another flick, then another, until he took a trembling mouthful and swallowed. Tears blurred her eyes, though she laughed softly through them, the sound trembling but full. "That's it. Good boy. That's it." It was not a feast, not even close. But it was a step, and every step mattered. Each one was a fragile thread woven back into the fabric of life he had almost surrendered. Still, healing was not only physical. Shadows lingered in his eyes, dark memories etched too deep to vanish quickly. When hands moved too fast near him, he flinched. When doors slammed, his body stiffened, breath caught in his throat. Trust was not yet built. It was something fragile, tentative, like a bridge of glass stretched across an abyss. He had been failed before, abandoned to the cold. To believe in safety again would take more than food, more than blankets. It would take time. The rescuer knew this. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though each gesture was a stone carefully placed to build that bridge. She spoke softly, letting her voice be the constant thread that tied him to each day. She sat on the floor instead of looming above him, meeting him at eye level, her presence steady, unthreatening. And though he did not lean toward her, he also did not turn away. That, too, was a victory. On the 10th night she returned late, exhaustion heavy in her body, snow clinging to her boots. The room was dim, a small lamp casting soft amber light across his blankets. She sank into the chair, ready for another long vigil. But when she reached out her hand, as she had every night before, something new happened. His paw shifted, not a twitch this time, but a deliberate press against her fingers. It was faint, almost hesitant, but undeniable. Her throat tightened. She held his paw gently, not squeezing, just resting there, letting the contact exist in its fragile, imperfect form. He closed his eyes, his breath slow and steady, as though the effort of that small gesture had drained him. But it was enough. It was everything. The German shepherd, once frozen in silence and surrender, was beginning to return, not in a rush, not in triumph, but in fragile, trembling steps. And with each step, the rescuer stayed beside him, ready to catch him if he stumbled, ready to whisper him back toward life. The hardest part of survival is not the moment when death loosens its grip, but the days that follow, when life asks you to fight for every inch. The German shepherd had been pulled back from the frozen edge, his body stabilized, his breath steadied. But now came the long, grueling climb from weakness into something resembling strength. Morning light slanted through the shelter's narrow windows, catching on the steel frames of kennels, bouncing off polished floors. The shepherd lay curled in his blanket, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was no longer desperate, but still fragile. His fur had begun to regain its softness under the care of warm baths, though patches remained thin, a testament to months of neglect. When he shifted, there was still a wince in his movements, muscles reluctant to answer his will. The rescuer crouched beside him, food bowl in hand, coaxing gently. Each day she tried a little more. Softened kibble mixed with broth, bits of chicken warmed to release their scent. He ate slowly, carefully, as though each swallow required deliberation. Sometimes he stopped halfway, lowering his head back to the blanket, exhausted by the simple act of chewing. But when her hand brushed his cheek, when her voice murmured encouragement, he would lift his head again and take another bite. The staff watched his progress with cautious hope. They spoke in low voices when passing his room, measuring improvement in fragments of steadier breath, longer stretches of wakefulness, the faint lift of his ears when someone entered. No one called him healed. Healing was a word reserved for victories far in the future. For now, he was surviving, and that was enough. But survival alone does not satisfy the spirit. On the 12th day, the rescuer brought a leash, coiled carefully in her hands. She did not clip it to his collar yet. She only let it rest beside him on the blanket. His eyes flickered toward it, recognition passing through them like a ghost. His body stiffened, as though the leash carried not memory of freedom but of control, of a past where trust had been fractured. She pulled it back gently, setting it aside. "Not yet," she whispered. "When you're ready." That readiness came in halting fragments. First, the twitch of a paw when she placed food just out of reach. Then, the tremble of muscles when he shifted forward, stretching across the blanket. The first time he tried to stand, his legs buckled immediately, sending him back down with a soft thud. His chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, eyes clouded with frustration and fatigue. She knelt beside him, hand pressed gently against his side, steadying him not with force but with presence. "It's okay. Try again tomorrow." The next day, he tried again. This time, his body wavered longer before collapsing. The rescuer's heart clenched at the sight of him trembling, struggling, yet refusing to remain still. She placed her hand under his chest, supporting his weight just enough for him to feel the shape of standing without carrying it all alone. His paws pressed against the floor, claws scraping faintly, his breath coming in short bursts. For a brief, flickering moment he stood, and then he sank back down, exhausted but alive with something new, the memory of movement. Each attempt was a battle, slow, messy, filled with collapse, but each collapse carried less defeat. By the third week, he could hold himself upright for several seconds, his legs trembling but resolute. By the fourth, he managed 2 steps before lowering himself back to the ground. Panting hard, eyes wide with both fear and wonder. The rescuer cheered softly, her laughter breaking the sterile air of the shelter. She did not clap, did not shout, for noise still unsettled him. Instead, she leaned close, her forehead nearly brushing his fur. "You did it," she whispered. "You're coming back." Yet the climb was not only physical. His spirit bore scars deeper than frostbite. He still flinched when a door banged too hard, his eyes darting with animal panic. He still recoiled when strangers entered the room, shrinking into his blanket as though bracing for harm. Trust was a currency he had been robbed of, and earning it back was a slow exchange, one gesture at a time. The rescuer became his constant. She never rushed him. She read beside him in the evenings, her voice low and steady, letting the cadence of her words weave into the rhythm of his breaths. Sometimes she sang softly, not songs of triumph but simple melodies, the kind one hums when rocking a child to sleep. The shepherd would close his eyes, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar comfort of safety. One afternoon, as sunlight warmed the shelter floor, she laid a hand gently against his neck. For the first time, he did not flinch. Instead, he leaned. Just slightly, just enough for his weight to acknowledge her touch. The moment lasted seconds, but it was the first brick placed in the fragile bridge of trust he was learning to cross. By the end of that month, the leash no longer frightened him. She clipped it gently to his collar one morning, waiting for his reaction. He stiffened, eyes wary, but did not pull away. Step by step, they moved toward the shelter door. The first attempt ended quickly, his legs buckling under the effort, but he tried again the next day, and the next. When they finally stepped outside together, the world seemed too wide, too bright. Snow had melted into patches of damp earth, and the air carried the scent of thawing soil. He sniffed cautiously, every movement tentative, as though the open world might betray him. But when she crouched beside him, her hand resting lightly on the leash, he glanced back at her, and his body loosened. For the first time, he walked more than a few steps, the leash a thread connecting them rather than a chain restraining him. Each day after brought new fragments of strength. His muscles thickened beneath his fur, his steps steadied, his appetite grew. The hollow look in his eyes began to fade, replaced not with joy yet, but with a quiet determination. He was learning, step by trembling step, to stand, not only on his legs but within his own fragile sense of belonging. The rescuer watched him with awe, every small victory written into her heart as if it were her own. She had not only found a dog in the snow, she had found a spirit wrestling its way back from silence. And as he stood taller each day, she realized something deep within herself was standing too, awakened by the quiet resilience of a shepherd who refused to surrender. The first time he ran, it was clumsy, unbalanced, and brief, yet it carried the weight of a resurrection. Weeks of trembling steps, faltering attempts, and cautious walks had led to this moment. The German shepherd stood in the shelter's enclosed yard, spring air stirring his fur, the leash slack in his rescuer's hand. The ground was soft beneath his paws, patches of grass pushing through the last stubborn remnants of winter frost. The sun, warm and golden, touched his back as though inviting him forward. For a long time he hesitated, sniffing at the earth, his body low and cautious. The rescuer crouched a few feet away, her eyes gentle, her hands open. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice carrying the rhythm of trust built in countless quiet hours. He looked at her, ears flicking, uncertainty shadowing his amber eyes. Then, as if pulled by some forgotten instinct buried beneath months of pain, he lifted his head and took a step. Another followed, steadier, firmer, until suddenly his legs found rhythm. His body leaned forward, muscles recalling what his spirit had nearly lost, the joy of motion. He ran. Not far, not fast, but enough. His paws struck the earth with uneven beats, his tail lifting, his breath rushing in sharp bursts. The rescuer's laughter broke the stillness, a sound light and unrestrained, and he turned his head as if startled by it. For the first time there was no flinch, no recoil. Instead, there was a flicker in his eyes, curiosity, even wonder. His body wobbled, his pace faltered, and then he stopped, chest heaving, tongue lolling. But he was standing tall, as fur glowing in the sunlight, as though the weight of frost and silence had finally loosened its grip. From that day, running became their ritual. Each morning, she clipped the leash with hands that no longer needed to coax or beg, and he stepped forward willingly. At first their walks circled the small yard, measured and careful, but as his strength returned, so did his eagerness. His strides grew longer, his tail began to wag, not wildly, but with the hesitant rhythm of joy rediscovered. The leash became less of a tether, more of a thread connecting two beings bound by survival and trust. The world opened itself to him in fragments of sensation, the scent of fresh grass after rain, the distant bark of other dogs carried on the wind, the warmth of sun on his coat, soaking into muscles once stiff with cold. Every day he paused to sniff the air, ears swiveling, eyes widening at the hum of life that pulsed beyond the shelter walls. And every day the rescuer walked beside him, her presence steady, her voice soft, as if translating this rebirth into words he could not understand but could feel. His playfulness returned in small sparks. The first time a ball rolled near his paws, he stared at it as though it were a foreign object. The rescuer picked it up, tossed it lightly. It landed with a dull thud a few feet away. He looked at her, then at the ball, confusion clouding his gaze. She smiled, crouching low, tossing it again. This time, something stirred, an instinct older than his memories of cold. He stepped toward it, nudged it with his nose, and for the briefest moment his tail gave a single wag. She clapped her hands softly, her face alight with joy, and though he didn't chase the ball, he lingered near it, no longer indifferent. Day by day, his steps grew bolder. He learned to bound, to lunge clumsily after toys, to leap forward with the awkward grace of muscles relearning freedom. Each movement carried the weight of victory. The shelter staff often paused to watch through the windows, their conversations trailing into silence as they witnessed the once frozen shepherd running with ears flapping, tongue out, the shadow of his former self shedding piece by piece. Yet joy was not simple, shadows still lingered. Sudden noises made him halt, his body low, eyes scanning as though expecting harm. A hand raised too quickly could still trigger a flinch, a reminder that scars run deeper than fur and bone. But now, he had the choice to recover, and each time the rescuer was there, crouching low, offering her hand, whispering reassurance. He would lean toward her again, more quickly each time, until fear loosened and trust reasserted itself. Their bond deepened in the unspoken language of companionship. In the evenings, after their walks, he would rest beside her as she read aloud, his head dropping onto his paws, eyes closing to the sound of her voice. Sometimes, when she grew quiet, he would glance up, as though searching for the sound that had anchored him through silence. She would smile, stroke his fur, and continue speaking. In those moments, she realized, they were teaching each other the same lesson, how to be present in a world that once felt unlivable. The first time he barked, it startled them both. It was a sharp, hoarse sound rusty from Dessous, directed at a squirrel darting across the yard. The rescuer laughed, clapping her hands, tears prickling her eyes. He turned to her, ears high, tail wagging faster than she had ever seen. It was as though he had found his voice again, not just in sound but in spirit. That bark was not anger, not fear. It was life declaring itself loud and undeniable. Weeks melted into months, and the shepherd transformed. His coat thickened, shining under sunlight. His muscles grew strong, his stride confident. The hollow look in his eyes gave way to alertness, curiosity, even mischief. He chased leaves, splashed through puddles, bounded clumsily after balls he never quite retrieved but always enjoyed pursuing. The world, once muted by hunger and pain, had become a canvas painted with color and sound. Through it all, the rescuer remained at his side, her own spirit lifted by his revival. She had found him frozen in silence, nearly gone, and now she watched him run, alive with joy. It was not only his story of rebirth, it was hers too. For in saving him she had uncovered a part of herself she hadn't known was waiting. The quiet strength to believe in miracles not as sudden lightning strikes, but as fragile sparks nurtured into fire. And as the shepherd bounded across the yard one bright morning, his paws pounding against the earth, ears flying, the rescuer stood watching with tears streaking her cheeks and laughter on her lips. For in that run, in that clumsy, beautiful sprint, was the truth of survival. Not just to exist, but to reclaim the pieces of life that make existence worth living. The day he went home did not arrive with fanfare. It came softly, like sunlight slipping through curtains at dawn, so gentle you hardly notice until the room is golden. The German shepherd had been running for weeks now, bounding across the shelter yard with legs once too weak to hold him, his coat glistening, his eyes alive again. Yet every evening, when the rescuer left, his gaze followed her to the door, a quiet longing that never wavered. She told herself he would be adopted soon. Families had inquired, names had been added to waiting lists. He was no longer the skeletal shadow discovered in the snow. He was strong, noble, beautiful again. Any family would be lucky to have him. But each time she filled out the paperwork for potential adopters, her hand paused, her chest tightened. She thought of his paw resting faintly against her fingers that 10th night, of the first trembling steps he took with her hand pressed under his chest, of the way his ears flicked toward her voice even in sleep. She told herself she was being practical, that her job was to rescue, not to keep. But deep inside, a truth had taken root long before she was ready to admit it. He wasn't just any dog. He was hers. The decision came one evening as rain tapped softly against the shelter windows. She sat beside him, reading aloud as she often did, her voice blending with the rhythm of falling water. He rested his head on her lap, his eyes half closed, his breath warm against her hand. She looked down at him and felt something shift, not sudden, not loud, but certain. The thought was no longer a question. It was a simple, steady truth. He was home already. Home was not a place waiting somewhere else. Home was here, in this connection they had built from silence, fear, and fragile survival. The next morning, she filled out the papers with steady hands. The shelter staff smiled knowingly. They had seen it coming long before she had admitted it. There were no speeches, no celebrations, just signatures on forms and the quiet acceptance of what had always been inevitable. When she clipped his leash for the last time inside those walls, it was not the tether of rescue but the thread of belonging. Her house was small, modest, with wooden floors and the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. When she opened the door and led him inside, he paused on the threshold, his body tense, as though uncertain he was allowed to cross. She crouched low, meeting his eyes, her hand brushing his fur. "It's yours now," she whispered. "This is home." He stepped forward cautiously, nose twitching, paws clicking softly on the floor. He sniffed the corners, the rugs, the legs of chairs. He paused by the fireplace, tilting his head at the faint scent of ash. His eyes flicked back to her, searching, as though asking if this was truly real. She nodded, tears pressing at her eyes, and patted the blanket she had laid near the fire. Slowly, he curled onto it, his body sinking into warmth, his head dropping with a sigh that seemed to release years of tension. For the first time since she had found him, his eyes closed not from exhaustion but from peace. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm. Morning walks through dew-damp grass. Afternoons spent in the yard, chasing bowls he still rarely returned but always delighted in fetching. Evenings by the fire, his body stretched against hers as she read, her voice weaving into the crackle of flames. The house grew fuller with his presence, every corner touched by his quiet resilience. Yet the most profound moments were not loud, not dramatic. They came in the stillness. The way he began to greet her at the door, tail wagging with joy instead of fear. The way he leaned into her hand without hesitation, pressing his weight against her as if anchoring himself in belonging. The way his eyes, once hollow with silence, now glowed with trust, curiosity, even playfulness. The scars of his past did not vanish. He still startled at thunder, still flinched at sudden noises. But now he had a refuge. Now he had arms that would hold him, a voice that would calm him, a home that would never cast him out into the cold. Healing, she realized, was not the absence of scars but the presence of love that made those scars bearable. On the first night of spring, she built a fire in the hearth, its warmth filling the small living room. The shepherd lay stretched on the rug, his body relaxed, his eyes following the dance of flames. She sat beside him, her hand resting on his fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath. Outside, the world was alive with renewal, buds breaking on trees, frogs singing in hidden ponds, the air carrying the scent of damp earth. Inside, she felt the same renewal echo in her chest. She thought of the day she found him, motionless in the snow, breath barely there, eyes fading into silence. She thought of carrying him in her arms, whispering desperate promises. She thought of the nights spent watching over him, the trembling steps, the first run, the first bark. And now, here he was, warm and alive, his body curled against hers in the safety of a home he could finally call his own. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, not of sorrow but of gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance given not just to him, but to her. For in saving him, she had been saved too, rescued from the quiet ache of loneliness, from the disbelief in small miracles, from the idea that hope could not be rebuilt. The German shepherd stirred, lifting his head to meet her gaze. In his eyes, no longer hollow but shining with life, she saw the story they had written together. One of silence broken, trust rebuilt, joy rediscovered. He pressed his head into her hand, and she leaned down, whispering the words that had carried them from snow to firelight. "You're safe now. You're home." And in the stillness of that night, with the fire crackling and the world breathing spring beyond the windows, the truth was undeniable. What began in the frozen silence of abandonment had ended in warmth, in love, in the quiet miracle of belonging, home at last.